Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. It's race week once again, this time in Bahrain. Big upgrades are in the pipeline for various teams to try and take down McLaren. Red Bull believe they've got something in the works which is going to help Max Verstappen win his 5th consecutive World Championship. But on the Ferrari side, things are not looking quite so rosy. Lewis Hamilton believes that his side of the garage have discovered a serious issue with his car which has been costing him performance compared to Charles Leclerc on the other side. What exactly is this problem? Can Ferrari solve it? But even if they do, he reckons they still need serious performance upgrades if they want to take down McLaren, the papaya team, this season. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. We have so much reaction today to get through. Firstly, on Kimi Antonelli. As you guys can tell, he's the front cover here that Formula 1 have put together for the Bahrain Grand Prix. I should probably say Bahrain at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. By the magic of video editing, we have now transported ahead a week. But speaking of Antonelli, he's on great pace to break Hamilton's record. Technically, it's a record anyway. So Hamilton scored 109 points in his rookie year in 2007. Antonelli's already at 30, so he's definitely going to get to 109. Of course, back then the point system was different, so Hamilton's 109 was actually more like 265, I think, is like what the conversion is, roughly speaking anyway. So if Antonelli gets to 265, that's kind of technically the record. We'll see if he can do it. It's obviously a tall order, but Antonelli's been brilliant so far. I think for many, Antonelli's probably been like the positive surprise of the season or driver that's impressed you the most. I think that's definitely in the conversation. I'm not massively surprised, really. Like, I rated Antonelli highly. And look, Antonelli, Behrman, drivers that... It was interesting because last year, those guys, because their Formula 2 campaign with Prema wasn't very good, people were wondering, maybe they're not as good as people think that they are. But it turns out they are. And Behrman and Antonelli, I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years' time, we have Behrman in a Ferrari, Antonelli in a Mercedes, or maybe somewhere else, both going at it for the World Championship. I think that would be a really cool story, given how well those two guys get on presently. And I can just picture the storylines when it's kind of like friends turn to enemies or whatever if they get into a title fight. We'll see if that happens in due course. But Antonelli's been killing it so far. There's plenty of other drivers that have had a great start to the season too. I think, to me, Isaac Hadjar is the driver who's impressed me the most just because he's been so much better than I expected him to be. And obviously the first round in Australia didn't go to plan. After that, I think the last couple of Grand Prix has been really impressive. It was a dull Grand Prix. No one is going to say any different. And Carlos Sainz even went as far to say, Suzuka has become a bit of a new Monaco. And even Fernando Alonso said that really in the last few years, has there been many good Grand Prix? Not really. So is it Suzuka's fault? Is it the car's fault? Like, fundamentally, it's the car's fault. I do think that there are questions, right, because the resurfacing of the track basically eliminated any degradation that was happening in the first sector. Definitely Pirelli need to think about bringing some softer compounds in the future. And just in general, the Pirelli tyres, I mean, look, it's easy to clown Pirelli. I know that they've got a difficult task on their hands. They've got to develop tyres that are what Formula 1 wants in every regard, that they degrade enough, but they, keep alive over a lap. The issue is that right now, there's management in the qualifying sessions and there's management in the race, because even in quali, the teams have to manage their tyres during a quali lap so they don't just fall apart in the third sector because they overheat. That's the primary issue with these tyres, is that they lose performance when they overheat and sometimes they just don't degrade. And that's what we saw this weekend. It's like, well, they manage in quali because they can't even push them flat out, but then you push them not flat out in the race and they last forever. So what's going on here? So that was an issue. There is an argument that you could maybe get rid of the final chicane at Suzuka and just have it send straight through onto the straight. I mean, it would open up, like, it eliminates one braking zone. It would maybe allow drivers to follow easier with an opportunity into turn one. But yeah, with these modern cars, it's borderline impossible to overtake to such an extent that I was guessing yesterday's video the delta that would be required to make an overtake happen on the car in front. But Mark Hughes was talking about it here, and there was discussion that, like, okay, even if Russell's Merc was on pole, apparently Max said this, I actually didn't see the quote, but apparently Max said that even if Russell started on pole in the Mercedes, he would have won without too much difficulty. Probably because of the same reason, right? Probably one of the reasons why Max was so ecstatic about his qualifying lap on Saturday was that he probably knew that really whatever he did, he was going to be able to convert it into the victory, given how difficult it is around here. And reportedly, I saw this other places as well, a 1.4 second advantage. So I guessed in yesterday's video that it was like a second. You got to be a second a lap faster than the car in front to overtake. Apparently it was 1.4 seconds a lap advantage, which the funny thing about that is that even on newer tyres, because the tyres weren't really degrading, it was possible that you wouldn't even be that much faster on a newer set. You know, there were a couple of overtakes happening throughout the Grand Prix, but, you know, I thought it was pretty remarkable. You know, in the opinion of Mark Hughes and many others, absolutely, if Russell was in the lead, Antonelli was in the lead, even, you know, maybe Leclerc and Hamilton, you know, if they had been leading the Grand Prix, they would probably have won, right? Which is pretty insane to think about when you think of Suzuka as this great track, which it is, but in the modern day, Carlos Sainz reckons it behaves more like Monaco. And even Fred Vasseur went as far to say that because of these factors, this year will probably be a quali championship, as in the victor will be determined based on qualifying fundamentally, which is a pretty big assessment. I think it makes sense in the context that the cars are relatively close in terms of performance at the front of the field, so getting a big delta is a challenge. The tyres don't seem to really, you know, at least in Suzuka, degrade to the extent that, you know, a faster car behind on fresher tyres will easily be able to get the move done. Track position has been king at the first few rounds. I mean, Piastri was on pole in China and won. Lando was on pole in Melbourne and won. Max was on pole in Japan and won. So we're 3 rounds in and we're 3 for 3 in terms of pole to win conversions. This is quite important really when it comes to ensuring that your car is great in qualifying. I mean, you know, the SF23, now we're a couple of years further down the line and the dirty air is even worse. And it seems to be, you know, look, the ground effect was meant to solve these problems. It never did. And certainly not nowadays, it hasn't done. The dirty air issue, the difficulty of following the cars in front, this is still a very prevalent issue to such an extent that maybe Ferrari wish that their car was slightly better suited to qualifying rather than they've tried to find a nice balance on that front over the last couple of years. We'll get back to Ferrari in a second, but speaking of Carlos Sainz, it is obviously a big talking point that Williams this year have scored. I know there's a bit of a typo here in the graphic, but let's just zoom into so we don't see that anymore. This is from Autosport. They've scored 19 points now so far this season. Last year, the whole of last year, they scored 17. But the notable thing is that of those 19 points, 18 of them have come from Alex Albon. One of them from Sainz, and only because of the disqualifications from the Ferraris back in China. So, very interesting start to the year. I know that Sainz has said it's going to take him, he reckons, maybe 5-10 races to really get up to the speed that he wants to be at. But I know there was a lot of questions this year. How good will Alex Albon fare against Carlos Sainz? Well, so far, brilliantly is the only real answer. And despite the radio drama, he was buzzing with his result at the end of the Grand Prix. This is an Alpine. And this is Franco Colapinto in the Alpine. And, well, what do we think about this? A difficult weekend for Jack Doohan, to say the very least. You can see how squirrely it is. Well, this is a great angle of the Ascari chicane. I mean, look at the correction that he has to make. You can see the rear end just like slightly set. You can see the slide that he has. He has to just correct it through the fast Ascari chicane. Beautiful corner at a beautiful track. And, yeah, this is certainly a fantastic angle. And you really get the centre speed that you don't necessarily get when you watch it always on TV, although I will say the new T-Cams have definitely helped with that, the wider field of view that they're now doing. But this is Colapinto doing a TPC, so testing previous cars program in Monza just yesterday. Look, likely this was planned anyway, but nonetheless, Jack Doohan had a really challenging weekend. I mean, he crashed into the wall because he didn't close the DRS. That was a big problem. And you guys may have seen the clip yesterday of Doohan struggling to get out of his car after the Grand Prix. And yeah, that was tough to watch. Presumably, the big impact on the Friday obviously affected his performance during the rest of the weekend. He actually still did pretty well in the Grand Prix, but it's not like, you know, Alpine or certainly Doohan have scored many, if any, points so far. So, you know, the rumour is 6 races in, the contract gets to the point where they can put Colapinto into the car. We obviously see the difficult weekend for Doohan in Suzuka, the repair damage that was caused. We've got Colapinto doing some testing at Monza. You know, you've got to think that there's some sort of correlation here potentially in the near future. And speaking of Alpine reserves, Hirakawa is out of there. Now, this is kind of crazy. He did FP1 instead of Doohan in Japan, and then literally a day later, he's gone. He's like, yeah, bye guys. And this isn't like, oh, he's going to get loans to Haas. He's just left Alpine, and Luke Smith discusses it, that he's spoken to Alpine, and Alpine say it's good to see drivers get further opportunities in the sport. We're happy to see Ryo link up with another team in the test and reserve driver role. The team wishes as well. He has left Alpine, apparently. So it's kind of a little bit strange, because it doesn't seem like Alpine have, like, announced this, but Hirakawa, he drove a session for Alpine, and then immediately he's gone, and he's over to Haas. Of course, Toyota Gazoo Racing Haas, so that relationship makes sense there. But of course, you got to wonder because, I mean, Alpine have like a million reserve drivers. They've got Paul Aron over there, and they've got Franco Colapinto for now, and then maybe he goes into the starting team, Doohan potentially steps back. It makes probably a bit of sense where Hirakawa might be going at the present time. Quickly on McLaren, because I've not seen that many comments out of McLaren after the weekend. I was hoping that I'd see something interesting from the team that said, oh, well, you know, at least we maximised the results or we scored the most points. And I'm like, you guys did not maximise the results. More was possible this weekend. At least they could have tried something else. We talked about that in some detail yesterday. Now, there was an interesting stat. Max has now won the last 4 Suzukas. And of course, well, he won the championship in the last 3 Grand Prix seasons. So does it mean he's going to win it this year again? He's obviously got a good chance. Not the favourite, but, you know, he's not leading the championship, but he's very close given the circumstances and given the current performance disadvantage that Max has in that Red Bull compared to where the McLaren seemingly is right now. And maybe that's going to change in due course. Max has done just a brilliant job. Now, it may be in Bahrain back to reality to some degree, but again, Bahrain's been a circuit like Japan, which has traditionally suited the Red Bull. Like, if there was any track that Max would have turned up to thinking, you know what, if I'm going to win a race this weekend or if I'm going to limit the damage, Suzuka was probably a good opportunity and he executed flawlessly. Maybe Bahrain isn't a million miles away either. But yeah, so interestingly enough, every driver who's finished second at Suzuka since 95 has not won the championship. So, look, I mean, maybe Lando will change that this season, but I thought it was notable, especially when you've got Helmut Marko talking about McLaren's strategy decision, saying that they would have swapped their drivers, because obviously at that point in the Grand Prix, it looked like Piastri was quicker. So the argument would be, well, swap the drivers, let him give it a go to win the Grand Prix and take on Max. I think realistically, it wouldn't have mattered anyway if they'd have swapped the drivers. Probably Piastri doesn't get by, and eventually they say, all right, guys, swap back before the line. That would have been worth a try, I think. Red Bull certainly would have done it. And Mercedes, a few years ago, not really in that position anymore, at least for now, but they certainly would have done it. McLaren didn't do it. My thinking is they just don't want to mess with that kind of internal dynamic the way that they see it. But I think it's just not a winning team's mentality, in my opinion. When Helmut Marko and Red Bull say that they would have done something different, you may disagree with their approach, Red Bull's approach, Marko's approach, the way they go about their business, but they do know how to win, to be fair to them. So I think there's some notes on that, especially when Lando Norris, right? I mean, look, I want to see how the season goes, obviously. It's early days to make too much of a judgment, but Lando, before the season started, was pretty adamant on this point that, well, you know, I'm my own man, I'm not necessarily going to behave like previous champions. You know, I think that I can win on my own terms without, you know, this maybe level of ruthlessness and aggression and uncompromising will to win that some previous drivers have had. Max Verstappen is included certainly in that category. Lando thinks that, you know, he can be a champion in his own way. And that's nice to think about, right? The sunshine and the rainbows. But maybe the reality is slightly different to that, especially when Max is, I mean, he's full of confidence, as he well should be. And this is I think this is translated from the Dutch, but this is a real quote. And he said, I don't even want to think about what would happen if I was in that other car, the McLaren. You wouldn't have even seen me. I'd have been on the plane back to, you know, Bahrain already next on his private jet before the McLarens would even finish the Grand Prix. So I think there definitely is a feeling, even from the likes of Ferrari, that it's good for the state of the championship that Max is not driving the McLaren, because if he was, good luck in anybody else winning the championship. But because he's not, it keeps things alive for McLaren, it keeps things alive for Red Bull, and it keeps things alive for Mercedes too, because, you know, Norris was the championship leader. Yes, George and Kimi didn't, you know, they were 5th and 6th in the end. It's good point, it's not spectacular, but they keep themselves in touching distance anyway, especially when Red Bull have upgrades in the pipeline. They believe McLaren may be negatively impacted by the front wing flexibility technical directive that's coming in for Spain. That's been a big talking point, that maybe it's going to hold McLaren back to some degree. We saw them tighten up on the rear wing flexibility. Has that slowed down McLaren? Seemingly not, but it has seemingly affected their straight line speed a little bit. That may be relevant. and Red Bull have upgrades on the way. So Max will be happy about the situation. I mean, as RBR Daily described, until the upgrades arrive and the TD arrives in Spain, it's about survival for Max, but like he's only 1 point behind in the championship right now, and it's going to be Imola where the big upgrade arrives. I think this has been known for some time. Dr. Rob's tweeted about it. I know that I talked about it on a video probably a week ago now or something, that you know, an upgrade package for Imola was in the works for Red Bull. Kravitz says that's what's going to be happening, right? It's a few rounds away. I mean, we've got Bahrain, Jeddah, Miami, I think, before then. So certainly a few more rounds of damage limitation to be done, and you don't go to Monaco until after Imola, so leading and winning from pole is probably going to be more of a challenge than it was this most recent weekend in Japan. But Ferrari, they ended 4th and 7th after the Grand Prix. There wasn't much else they really could have done. I don't think George was ever getting past Leclerc in a million years based on this advantage that we saw that you needed to overtake. Hamilton, I mean, in hindsight, the move on Hadjar was actually quite impressive, given that the Racing Bulls was not really a slow car. But Hamilton had nothing to do, and at the end of the Grand Prix, you know, presumably he could have pushed harder, but there was just no need. So, you know, save the engine wear and all that type of stuff. Make sure you don't burn too much rubber on the tyres and get yourself disqualified. But Ferrari, understandably frustrated about the way the season has started. They are 58 points down compared to where they were at the start of last year. And that, of course, was the start of last year where Red Bull were dominating. It's not like Ferrari were winning all the races last year. Like, this was also not a spectacular start to last year's season in many respects. Obviously, they're lucky that Verstappen isn't wearing orange, and Hamilton believes that the Ferrari is 3 to 4 tenths of where the McLaren currently is, which isn't a million miles away. But in the final year of the regulations, that's a difficult margin to find. Ferrari, though, believe that their car is better than they've currently showed. There are ways they think to improve the balance, to improve the performance as a result. Vasseur says before bringing updates to improve performance, we need to fix the balance issues currently affecting us. If we maximise the car's potential, there is still more performance to extract, they say. And it's a tricky one, really, for Ferrari, because they decided that they would completely change their car, really. 99% different, change of front suspension, and overhaul everything on the final year of the regs. It was a big risk. Had they not taken the risk, they may be faster now. Would they have won the championship? You know, probably not. This maybe was their best attempt, but so far it looks like it's backfiring. Now, Hamilton said something very interesting on the state of the Ferrari right now, certainly his Ferrari. Now, we talked about it last year, this whole idea of like the sabotage at Mercedes when his tyres weren't up to temperature and this type of stuff. Now, I don't think Hamilton's lying in this instance, right? I don't think there would be any reason to do so, and clearly his side of the garage has found something, at least as far as he describes, that has been affecting his performance. Now, even with this, he still won the sprint in China very impressively. So given the opportunity and the advantage, Hamilton will be able to execute still. But, you know, he's obviously been pretty underwhelmed by his own performance over the last couple of weekends. His performance in the Grand Prix compared to Leclerc, you know, is maybe a tenth and a half behind, something in that ballpark in terms of average race pace yesterday. And Hamilton says that we found something on the car that was underperforming for the last 3 races. So I'm hoping that when that is fixed, I will start to get better results onwards and upwards. So bit of a question as to, okay, well, if the car's been broken, is that affecting both drivers? And, you know, Craig Slater tried to get a bit of clarification on this. And, well, I'll just share what Hamilton had to say, because at the end of this, he makes it quite clear that he believes this was only an issue affecting his side of the garage.
We found something on the car that's not been underperforming for the last 3 races. So I'm really hoping when that's fixed, I'll start getting a bit better results. But yeah, I mean, I'm losing just over a tenth a lap with this issue we have. So I'm hoping in the next race it's fixed, and then otherwise qualifying clearly is really important to get a good qualifying, and I'm not extracting the best out of the tyres. So that's something they're aware of it, and they don't know what's cool. They don't know why. And so, as I said, when the new component comes, hopefully it'll be gone and it'll be the same across cars. Considering that, I'm relatively happy with the race pace that I did have.
So what is this problem? Of course, it's not something that Ferrari would have done deliberately, maybe it's a bit of damage that was picked up on the car a couple of Grand Prix ago that went unnoticed until now. It's, you know, something that costs you a tenth a lap is relatively minor, but it's something that they've noticed clearly in the data that's been affecting Hamilton's performance. He reckons it's costing him, you know, a tenth, just over a tenth a lap. If it's something that reduces downforce as well, that also makes tyre degradation marginally harder. That, you know, adds up over the course of a Grand Prix. So very interesting, really, if Hamilton is, you know, having this issue. It's been affecting his performance the last couple of rounds. The implication being that, assuming that they fix this, Hamilton reckons that, you know, he can get at least a tenth, if not a bit more, in terms of performance going forwards, which will put him in a decent spot. But frankly, a spot which is not good enough. So that, you know, argument is a very interesting one. That Hamilton's suggesting here the cars aren't necessarily the same, but he does say that he expects that to change very shortly. The big deal, though, for Ferrari, if they actually want to win stuff, is whether their upgrades are going to work, because they have a new floor set for Bahrain. The thing is, with the floor, we were kind of discussing what's it going to do. We've talked about rear instability, that they're trying to resolve some of these issues, but there was maybe a feeling that, well, the new floor may help them lower the ride height. But reportedly, maybe it's just a fundamental issue in the car, and if it really is a fundamental issue, the season's over for Ferrari. It's just straight up as a fundamental, like, it's just over for Ferrari, because they want to run their car at a certain ride height. They did that in China, and, well, they won the sprint and they got disqualified. If they lower it to a certain height that they want to run it at, that presumably they did their calculations before the season on running it at, they get excessive skid wear, they bring in the risk of bouncing again. So reportedly, the updated floor is designed to generate better downforce at the current ride heights. So they can't lower it, is the implication here. I guess we'll see. Maybe there's further changes they can make. Maybe they bring the floor and they realize, you know, we actually can lower it further. But they'd be taking some risk in the process. So what do you guys think about this? New floor for Bahrain. It's meant to improve their performance, but it's not necessarily going to improve it by enough if they can't raise the ride height or lower the ride height to where they really want it to be. So, yeah, we'll see. I mean, the SF25 has problems. This should resolve some of them. It may or may not be enough, but, you know, if this gives them a couple of tenths and Hamilton gains another tenth because they fix whatever issues underlying his car, that puts them in the conversation. So, look, Ferrari will always be in the conversation, but it may simply be too little, too late this year. But very much interested in your thoughts on all of this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.